Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, and welcome to Next Economy Now podcast. My name is Erin Axelrod. I'm a partner worker owner at Lift Economy. I'm joined today by John Fullerton. John Fullerton is an unconventional economist, teacher, writer, impact investor, and philosopher. After walking away from Wall Street in 2001, he founded the Capital Institute in 2010 with a mission to reimagine economics and finance in service to life, which manifested as regenerative economics and regenerative finance in 2015. John was featured in the award-winning documentary Going Circular and is a member of the Club of Rome. And this is our second time having John on the podcast. We had him back in, I think it was 2017, 2018.
Been a while. Good to be back with you, Erin.
Welcome to the show, John. So to kick us off, share with us, we've heard your story of how you got into this, but for those that haven't had a chance to listen to our previous podcast, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the work you're doing today.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me back, and congratulations on your ongoing great work in this epic challenge that we've all found ourselves in. Real briefly, I had a wonderful career on Wall Street. I always refer to the place I worked as the old JP Morgan. It had a very special culture and a much smaller place than it is today. And as you said, I walked away in 2001, a few months before 9/11. I was actually downtown when 9/11 happened, and that sort of shook me to the core. And I spent many years really searching for what I wanted to do in the world and what was happening in the world. And in that search, I discovered the environmental crisis for the first time as a systemic issue. I read Limits to Growth. I read Herman Daly. I read a lot of books bankers don't read. And it kind of hit me slowly that the world was breaking because of the economic system. And as a financier, it became very clear to me that if that was true, there was something about finance and those of us who thought we were so smart, who were driving the economy, that was, that related to the root cause. And so I've really been just kind of completely obsessed with this question of how to rethink, redesign, reimagine an economy that would actually work, to use an expression without self-terminating, an expression that I've heard Daniel Schmachtenberger use. And that's not an easy question to answer. And honestly, the idea of a regenerative economy came through one of my impact investment projects with a man named Alan Savory in the Savory Institute. And I learned about managing large landscapes, grassland landscapes, using what Alan calls holistic decision-making. And the idea hit me that if this can work on the living system we call the grasslands, why couldn't it work on what I call the living system of the economy? And so that's really where the roots of regenerative economics comes from, is sitting out on the grasslands.
Well, you're in very good company, John. We here at Lift Economy are also quite preoccupied with this question of how do we make an economy that works for all life? And I do spend some time in the grasslands too. We might get to that. So in our last podcast, we kind of ended with this question, and I'm curious if you have a response, another iteration of the response. Can you share with us some examples of organizations that you feel are employing regenerative economics principles? I'd like to start with the examples first to kind of animate it for folks, and then we can get into some definitional space. But let's share the stories first.
Well, as you know, I often resist trying to give examples because once someone has an example in their head, they think that that's what regenerative economy is. And it'd be like, if I were to ask you, so give me an example of life. And you might say a tree, you might say a mountain, you might say a rainforest, you might say a child. But whatever you said would put a picture of it in your head that would be too limiting. So the first thing to say is, warning, this is not what regenerative means. because regenerative really means life. I mean, it is literally as as simple and as profound as that. Regeneration is the process that explains how life works. And so, but I will answer your question, and I'll answer it a little bit with some trickery. The first easy answer is, again, going back to the grasslands and this idea of holistic planned grazing. But more broadly, I think for your audience, people are generally familiar with regenerative agriculture, broadly defined. And so agriculture should be understood as the foundation of any human economy, and humans' interaction with the biosphere and with landscapes is. I was driving in a truck once with Jim Howell, one of the grasslands practitioners, and we were driving, through quote unquote the middle of nowhere. And he looked out the window and he pointed out to me and he said, all of that land is managed by somebody, either managed or mismanaged or not managed, but someone is making a decision about how to manage that land. And because of the scale of the human project, we live in a world where it's virtually true. It's not entirely true, but most places one goes on this planet is to some degree managed in some way by humans. And so agriculture is, again, broadly defined. I would include forestry and fisheries, anything that has to do with securing food from natural systems can be managed in a degenerative industrial way, which is the way we've decided to do it, with all kinds of horrible consequences, including, by the way, the Green Revolution, which was meant to solve problems, became the source of more and more problems than it solved. And so shifting into a regenerative mode where one heals the land, one builds soil, one builds biodiversity, one builds soil itself and water retention while growing food or procuring nutrients is a massive example of the regenerative economy, the base level that most people think about. But I quickly want to, and by the way, my work with Alan Savory, I've experienced the regeneration of large landscapes. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's measurable. It definitely works. And so that's the key. And the magic of it is that by making decisions holistically, ranch managers are able to unlock potential that others managing similar ranch land don't see. So there's a bit of magic in this. There's an unlocking of potential that is profoundly important and is the essence of life itself, is this endless potential. So that's one example, the one that most people would associate with the regenerative paradigm, but it's by far not the only one. A second one, and this maybe is an example of seeing what others see, but through a regenerative lens, and one sees things quite differently. Many people in the new economy space are excited about cooperatives. In fact, I think you said that you guys are a cooperative, right? At the beginning?
Yeah.
So the cooperative structure is an interesting way to create, what I would call empowered participation in the governance of an organization. And probably one of the largest and one of the best known examples of this at a large scale is the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain. Now, most of the studies that one would read about that will talk all about cooperative ownership and cooperative governance. I look at Mondragon through a regenerative lens, and sure, I see cooperative governance, but I see an ecosystem of businesses managed as an ecosystem rather than individual businesses managed individually. And that's a profound difference. And in fact, the more I've learned about it, the more I've put it as my poster child for the regenerative economy, because they actually transfer resources the same way trees do in a forest between them. So, for example, they pool profits every year and distribute them in such a way that is best for the health of the whole, not best for the health of an individual business. And they do their capital allocation in a pooled way as well. And they have their own bank, which has real returns on capital invested, but has caps on the returns on capital invested, and the surplus goes into the health of the whole. So it's a brilliant example of the regenerative economy that was founded decades ago before anyone was talking about the regenerative economy, which tells me that the regenerative economy is everywhere if we just learn how to see it. And I'll give, as my third example, maybe even more radical to make my point, the internet is the regenerative economy. And the internet exponentially accelerates the ability to circulate information. And circulation of information, everything is information. Energy is information. And as we move into an information age, it becomes even more fundamental to an economy as we shift away from material and energy that, as we traditionally think of it, fossil fuel energy, and move into, an information economy, a knowledge economy. The circulation of information, just like the circulation of blood in one's body, is a profoundly important characteristic or quality. And so the internet enables exponentially more circulation, which doesn't mean that the internet business models are regenerative. And what we've allowed to happen is that we've allowed businesses to use the internet in the old extractive model. And so extracting data and advertising business models are horribly degenerative with all kinds of externalities, as we call them. But the profound potential of the internet itself is the regenerative economy, if we learn how to see it that way.
Well, thank you for that. And you've kind of gone into some definitions around what is regenerative economics, regenerative being the process by which life happens. Could you elaborate on that and also talk through some of the principles that you use in your teaching of how to get to regenerative economics?
Sure. So, I have tried to distill to as few a number of kind of first principles as possible to describe this process of life. And I've studied ecology, systems ecology, biology, to a fair degree. I don't have a PhD. I'm not a scientist by any means. But I think there's a difference between kind of the laws of physics and the way we describe how life works. One of my teachers is a guy named Bob Ulanowitz, and he talks about life has tendencies toward certain patterns. So it doesn't mean that they're universal, absolute, always that way. As an example, males have a tendency toward being larger than females, but that doesn't mean that all males are larger than all females, just as an example. And what we find in studying living systems is that there are both patterns and principles that repeat themselves across scales, from the microscopic literally to the cosmic. And, one of those patterns would be, and again, people can use different words to describe it, but the relational interdependence of things. Everything's connected to everything. That's now accepted science, and it's profoundly different from thinking about an economy or anything else as a machine comprised of a group of parts that you put together in a certain way. It's, the relationships among the parts are more profound and important than the parts themselves. So, I don't want to go through 8 principles here, but the idea is to learn how life works. And that's the key. We call that ecology, or systems ecology, perhaps to be more precise. That should be required education for anybody living in this world. Fundamental, more important than math, more important than just about anything. I mean, I don't want to get into an argument about that, but it's fundamental. And how few people who are leaders of economic policy making, of business, or of finance actually have ever taken an ecology class, much less are knowledgeable about ecology. And so the point is that if we study how life works, we will discern these patterns and principles. They will become self-evident. And the scientists broadly agree on them, even though they use different words to describe them. Again, things like relational, things like having a healthy metabolism, healthy inputs, circulation of materials, and then healthy outputs. These are descriptive qualities of life. They are not ethical principles, just to be clear. This has nothing to do with human ethics. This has to do with how all life works. And so the premise of shifting to a regenerative economy is if we align our economy, and an economy includes all businesses, all government entities, all farms, all schools, it's kind of like the sum of everything because it's all part of the economy. If we align, and another core principle of living systems and of life is this fractal structure, this holistic structure where patterns repeat from large scale to small scale. So if the economy is to be regenerative, all of the parts of the economy need to be regenerative, just like you as an individual and me as an individual need to be regenerative, or we're not alive. We want our families to be regenerative. We want our communities to be regenerative. The idea of regenerative economics is if we align with these same patterns and principles that describe how life works, we will be creating the conditions for this potential to emerge. So it's not about setting better goals or different goals, although goals are useful. It's about aligning with life to create the potential for more life to emerge. And that's profoundly different than most of the recipes for fixing the broken economic system, which tend to be more around policy direction. And, to echo what Carol Sanford likes to say, we need to arrest the disorder. So if someone is in a car accident and they're bleeding, you need to get them to the hospital and stop the bleeding. But that's very different than that person deciding to get into a health and fitness regime that create the conditions for health over the long term. And so the regenerative economy is about creating the conditions for health over the long term, which doesn't substitute for arresting the disorder in the short term, if that makes sense.
I think I'd love to get into some of your partnership and collaboration work because of the example you just gave, in the context where we, of course, recognize that in a societal context that is making everyone sick by the way, a small handful of folks in power have designed the systems of our life, we know that, individuals cannot overhaul the system kind of in individual silos. So I'd love to hear your take on kind of the Capital Institute classes, your partnerships development. What are you doing collaboratively across institutions to transform the way our economy works?
There's no simple answer or I don't intend to trivialize how important your question just was. I mean, we all feel helpless to shift the monolith of the system, and at times hopelessly so. And I've had conversations with CEOs of big businesses who feel helpless to change the system. They see what we see, but they're trapped in a system as well. So again, this isn't about bad guys and good guys. There are bad guys out there for sure, but even the good guys feel trapped in the system and helpless to change it. And just as an example, if a CEO on his or her own wants to radically change their business model that would have a short-term, cost implication on their profits, they got a board of directors that'll boot them out the door as quick as you can say go. And so it's a true, we've really created a brilliant, masterful, ingenious trap for ourselves that is very difficult to imagine how to escape. And, the best thinking that has resonated with me on this, acknowledging that reality and not being naive about it and pretending that it's not as difficult as it is. The best thinking that I've come across is by a Nobel chemist, Prigogine, who, and I'll paraphrase, says that this is, decades ago, when a system is in chaos, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. So what that means for me is that our task, your task, my task, all of our tasks, who see this and are feeling helpless about what to do about it, none of us can fix this on our own. No big corporation can fix this on their own. But what we can do and what we have agency to do is to build islands of coherence that can then connect together, and eventually those islands of coherence can shift the system. And that actually is science. The scientists who describe system change talk about what are called phase shift transitions. And, pressures build and pressures build and pressures build, and suddenly, boom, the whole system shifts. A simple example being you put a pot of water on the stove and turn on the heat. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's boiling and it's an entire different state. And so, I can't prove that building islands of coherence will actually work, but I haven't heard of a more compelling strategy or theory of change than that. And I think the challenge we face is to connect these islands of coherence. Right now, there are thousands of islands of coherence out there, but we find it very difficult to connect them and truly collaborate in ways that, in a sense, allow our egos to step aside and, work as ecosystems. I think that's the big challenge. And, my hope for this is that my work is not just, one idea that's better than the next idea, so come to my island rather than your island. All of the work I see in the regenerative economy sits within regenerative economics. Not all of it, most of it does. So it's a worldview shift. It's not an alternative set of policies or approaches. But, that's the way I see it. And everyone sees things differently. Apparently, there's research that shows that we all actually look at the same facts and have a very different perception of them, which is both fascinating and terrifying.
If you've ever had a conversation with somebody where you make an agreement and then go on with your life, you know what that it can look like in practice, right? Because we always have different perspectives of what we agreed to.
Exactly. Even if it's written down.
It's true. Well, I love that you bring so much human psychology and empathy into this work, because some of my mentors are Dr. Roxanne Manning and my business partner, Phoenix Soleil, who talk a lot about how we work with humans, the reality of the psychology that keeps us stuck. And yeah.
And, one of the things that I'm increasingly interested in is this whole field of trauma, because one of the things I've read about is that our addictions are rooted in trauma. And if you think about it, we're addicted to a growth economy. Bob Costanza has actually written a book about this. He sort of followed the 12-step philosophy to think about how we could get unaddicted to the growth economy. But our addiction to growth is undoubtedly rooted in all kinds of traumas that we don't even acknowledge or are conscious about. Fears and traumas, or traumas that are rooted in fear, fear of not having enough, fear of identity, and all this stuff. So, again, if one listens to a conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger, you very quickly realize that the trap we've set for ourselves is perfectly designed to be very difficult to escape. I do think the reason I remain hopeful is that, and I've never even heard Daniel talk about it, but the magic of life, the process that is life, is a miracle. In the face of entropy, life continues to complexify. And the reason I think that we don't talk about this as much, because that miracle part, that magical part, that potential part exists in the world of the non-material. By definition, if it's potential, it doesn't exist yet in the material world. And so there's nowhere to put in a spreadsheet. There's no way to quantify it in advance. There's no way to even know which direction it's going to be in.
No way to make money off it.
Well, there's probably a way to make money off it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, not that that's the goal, but if you unlock potential that creates abundance and creates value, there's, going back to the grasslands example, if you manage a pasture holistically, it will produce more forage. And that is more profitable than less forage. Certainly more profitable than dirt at the extreme, or a desert. So I actually think there's, again, a pathway to prosperity, both material and certainly non-material, that is way larger than we realize. Because, I like to use the metaphor or the allegory of Plato's cave. We're trapped in a cave and we don't see what really exists in the real world, because we've designed this system where we only value what's material and what's mechanical and what we can measure. And we're trapped in this reductionist, it's the left side of our brain knowledge as opposed to the right side of our brain knowledge. And we demean the right side of the brain and we emphasize the left side of our brain. But the left side of our brain isn't good at seeing potential that doesn't exist because it's very analytical. I'm grossly oversimplifying that. If your listeners are interested in that, I highly, highly recommend reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary.
There's so many directions we could take this. And what's coming up for me is a thread we've touched on as well, which is the kind of, when you talk about, we've designed this trap. I recognize that many of our listeners may be saying, well, I didn't design it. Like, folks with much more power and agency than I have designed it, potentially even, thinking through the legacies of white supremacy and colonialism. But I'd love for you to touch on, all of those pieces are important. And I imagine there's 2 to 3 aspects of the financial sector that keep you up at night. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on, what are some of the pivotal challenges facing us, this movement?
Well, I do believe finance, in the regenerative space, we talk about removing obstacles that are in conflict with how life works. There is a belief that if we simply remove obstacles and get out of the way, life creates the conditions for life, to quote Janine Benyus. But we have put obstacles in the way. And I do think the financial system, and honestly, and this is what I teach in the course, finance ideology is really the obstacle. The idea that optimizing for financial returns, which is the design of the system, that is the system we've designed, that is what capitalism, everyone talks about capitalism as about private ownership. That's true. But I believe the far more insidious quality of capitalism is not the ownership question, although we can talk about what's wrong with the ownership model. It's, in a sense, the algorithm. It's the whole point, which is to optimize what we call risk-adjusted return, which tends to mean short-term risk-adjusted return. And all of the deployment of investment capital, which in a sense is the bridge to the future, whatever we invest in today becomes the economy of tomorrow, is done in such a way as to optimize risk-adjusted return to capital. The internal rate of return has nothing to do with systemic health. It has to do with the internal health, meaning to the investor. But that's what we do without thinking of it as being a problem, because we think in a reductionist way rather than a holistic way. And by the way, this is true in education, it's true in medicine, it's true in real estate development, it's true in our whole legal system is structured around, my private property, my rights versus your rights, as opposed to a collective set of rights. So, this is a big project. But to get back to your question, it's interesting. It's the perfect day to ask that question, because today, I haven't checked to see what's happening, but today, Donald Trump's social media company is trading on the stock exchange for the first time. And again, I haven't checked to see what's happened. But as of last night, what was expected to happen is that a fledgling little company with like $3 million of revenues was going to be worth something like $4 to $5 billion because of the speculative frenzy around this idea. It's become a meme stock. And how this was ever listed on a stock exchange is one question. But the speculative frenzy around it is, to answer your question, I think at the heart of what's wrong with finance, which is that we don't even realize the distinction between speculation and real investment. And people going back to John Maynard Keynes and many before him have understood the danger of allowing the financial system to become a speculative casino. And we now debate whether regulation is good or bad based on whether it hurts market efficiency. And market efficiency is thought to create economic growth. And so if we intervene with markets and make them less speculative, we will hurt market efficiency and therefore hurt economic growth and therefore hurt our prosperity. All of that is terrible, bad, ill-informed, if not ignorant thinking. And so, the first thing I would do if I were king of the world is radically intervene to reduce the amount of speculation in financial markets. And that would accomplish many goals, but one of them is it would force investment capital into more productive uses than just speculation. And we all talk about how we're going to find the money to finance renewable energy in Africa. Well, it's all in a speculative casino. That's where it is. So if we make that less attractive or illegal, suddenly there'll be lots of money to move to fund other stuff that we need to do. So that'd be the first one. And then I guess I would say I'll be controversial. I think people have done research to show that finance attracts a disproportionate number of psychopaths compared to the population as a whole. And the research I've read shows that finance has 10 times more psychopaths per capita than the society as a whole. I think if someone did research on big tech, they'd find a similar circumstance. And I think we need to get serious about restraining psychopaths to be in positions of power. And I know that's a controversial, I'm going to get a lot of arrows, I'm sure, for saying that. But, we don't let someone who's blind fly airplanes because having good eyesight is a useful thing to have for flying airplanes. And there's too much at risk if an airplane crashes. And the clinical understanding of psychopathology shouldn't allow, people who exhibit those tendencies clinically to have positions of power that can harm the collective. And, we saw in the financial crisis that a few people can really do a lot of damage. And now we're seeing it in technology. And yet we're so trapped in our finance ideology and our freedom ideology that we feel helpless about it. So that would be I don't know how to do that, by the way, sort of an application test that you need to pass, a license. You need to get a license to run a bank or run a hedge fund bigger than a certain size. And you got to pass the test, just like you need a driver's license.
Well, here's maybe like a carrot iteration of this. When you talk about the magic of life and creating systems whereby we can create economies that partner with and contribute to life, who better to do that than female leadership, right? In terms of those that bring life into the world. And I'm a new mom. I have a 5.5-month-old, and that process of birthing life, and there's so many other ways of bringing life forward, not just a physical act of birthing a baby. But I am curious, who are some of the top female economic leaders that you gain inspiration from as we kind of bring our conversation to a close?
Yeah. Well, I know you know this, which is why you're asking the question, but I do 100% agree with you that, and it's not that this is a women versus man thing, but again, getting back to the two ways of thinking, the two ways of seeing the world, left brain, right brain, to simplify it, the attributes of left brain thinking are competition, grabbing, reductionist logic, sort of power. And the more right brain are things like intuition, empathy, collaboration, beauty, imagination. And again, dangerous to oversimplify, but there are tendencies toward these right brain attributes to be more associated with feminine energy, women, than men, which doesn't mean that, I'm not at all saying it's absolute, but that is a, researchable thing that tends to be true. And certainly men can exhibit more balanced, right brain, left brain approaches than many do. But it is interesting. So here's one fact. The people attracted to my course on regenerative economics, I don't have the actual data, but I'm sure it's roughly 70% women. It might be higher. And that's now, I don't know, 1,200, 1,300 people have been through it from many, many countries. So, and I made a point in the course to amplify and put on a pedestal women leaders in the section when we talk about leadership. And I hate to mention names because if I mention one name, then there's 5 that will be insulted that I didn't mention them. But, in the field of leadership, certainly Laura Storm is one of the regenerative leaders that has an amazing, courageous life story. The practitioners doing the work on the ground, I refer to them as women warriors. Again, I'm a little hesitant to throw names out because I'll insult people that I don't. But absolutely, I would say 5 out of 6 women who are doing amazing work on the ground that is regenerative in nature, whether it's investment portfolios or landscape regeneration, far more often than not, they're women. And so I do think we're experiencing a rebalancing of this masculine energy. It's not that we need women instead of men. It's that the masculine energy and feminine energy is out of balance. And we've highlighted and governed by the masculine energy, the patriarchy, with all of its negative consequences for a long, long time. And I think we live at a moment where the consequences of that are becoming apparent. And so we're in this transformation to reset the balance. And to reset the balance will mean not more females on boards of directors so we can check a box. It will mean actually allowing and empowering women to be truly, what they want to be and not fit into the mold that we've defined as, masculine type leader. So you can be on the board of directors if you demonstrate the masculine leadership skills. So I don't know, this is a long conversation, but I do think that this next shift, and I'm talking about the next decades, not next years, is the moment for us to listen to and empower feminine leadership.
It's so interesting. You mentioned not naming names. I'm going to throw in a few just because I I think it's important. I actually, a while back, I created what I called a incomplete list of women economists who inspire me. And I hear the concern of I don't want to pull one out at risk of not naming all the others. But just to give you some insight of why I framed the question as I did, when I was newly getting into this work, it was so challenging for me to hear the names of women economists, right? Because as you mentioned, it's so dominated. So just for the 70% of participants in your course, I'll name Eleanor Ostrom, Donella Meadows, Nicole Foss, Namaka Agbo. I'll share the list with you,
John, and maybe I'll
Great.
share it on the course
Thank
platform.
you for doing
so
that. Kate Raworth, certainly
Kate
you'd have to put on the list.
Yes. Yeah.
I just love this changing the paradigm. So more women especially see themselves as economists.
The other trouble I have is I'm always terrible at pulling names off the top of my head. But, another one who is not in the regenerative space, but has been incredibly courageous is Stephanie Kelton, part of the modern monetary theory crowd. And again, I see MMT as a tool for the regenerative economy, even if the MMT people don't see it that way, at least not yet. I think we're moving in the right direction. But the truth is the economics profession has been incredibly male dominated, difficult, really tough to break into as a woman. And my response to that is the discipline is bankrupt and women shouldn't worry about breaking into a bankrupt discipline. If you're looking for an example of that, you need to look no further than I think it was 2018 Nobel Prize in economics, which by the way isn't a legitimate Nobel Prize, but it was awarded to a man, William Nordhaus, for his work on what we call environmental economics, which should never be confused with ecological economics, much less regenerative economics. And he won the prize for his work on climate change. And his great conclusion of all of his modeling is that we should set as a target 3.5 degrees warming Celsius, because anything lower would cost too much in terms of economic growth. And he still stands by that position. When the climate science consensus obviously that's a disaster. So I think it's an interesting dilemma and I don't mean to minimize this at all. And I understand the need for making livelihoods and making impressions and making careers. But to try to climb a mountain that's a bankrupt mountain is not the best use of anyone's effort. When I was in my deep, dark searching period, which was difficult and not fun, I read a book called The Wrong Mountain. And I think many of us are climbing the wrong mountain. And, my advice to, younger women seeking to make a name in the field of economics is, to fight your way into the traditional economics academy with peer-reviewed research, going deeper and deeper into little rabbit holes is just not the right mountain. Herman Daly never won a Nobel Prize. He was never accepted in the Academy of Economics. He worked in the geography department, I think, because I wouldn't let him in. And he's a man. Mm. If he was a woman saying what he was saying, he wouldn't be allowed anywhere near the economics. but he pursued it outside the field. So that's what my advice would be for all of the brilliant young women who are interested to work in the field.
Well, John, thank you once again for taking the time to share your story and your thoughts with our listeners. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we close?
If this is interesting, come join our course community. It's really been a super rewarding experience for me personally. And I know from the feedback, it's a tribe. It's a place where people feel like they're not alone and they find people to collaborate with. I believe they're finding lifelong friends and long-term work collaborators. And it's an island of coherence in a storm that's only going to get more chaotic in the years to come. So come join us.
Thank you so much, John. And I so look forward to federating the Next Economy MBA community as well with that.
The island of coherence that
we've talked about that. We need to do that.
Great.
It's actually a perfect example of two islands of coherence that need to be better connected. So let's put that on our to-do list.
Absolutely. Well, have a wonderful day. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Be well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.